If you're looking to buy a franchise, there's good options and then there's bad options. And unfortunately, unless you have experience, it can be difficult to really differentiate the two until after you purchase, in which case it's too late. My name's Steve Rossioli, and I grew my first business to over a seven-figure revenue in less than 3 years, to which I then franchised and now have transitioned into franchise consulting, where I've worked with hundreds of candidates to find good franchise options. Now, the good news is I've identified three red flags that will hopefully allow you to spot a potential bad brand before you buy, even if you don't have any franchise experience. Now, before we get into the actual information, what I first want to do is define what I mean by red flag. Because typically, when you hear red flag, that's usually a sign to stop and run away, but that's not necessarily the case here. When I say red flag, all that is an indicator or an alert that you have to spend specific attention to that aspect of the business, which will help to evaluate whether you're looking at a good or a bad brand. So, the first red flag is the brand treats their development process like a sales process. Now, what is development? Development is the totality of conversation that you're going to have with the brand, starting from the initial phone call, going all the way up until decision time, where you make a determination on whether you want to move forward or not. This is a learning and evaluation period for you to have a clear understanding of exactly how the business model works and ultimately if it's going to be a good fit. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course the brand's going to be selling me in this time because this is their opportunity to get another franchisee in the system. But good brands that have a tight knit business model, they don't sell franchises, they award them. To better explain this, it helps to think about how franchisors actually make their money, and they do so with a royalty. Now, the royalty is a percentage of top line sales, and there's only so many territories that a franchise brand can award. So ultimately, they're incentivized to maximize the total revenue of each of their locations, which in turn maximizes their profit. So good brands are really particular about who they actually award territory because if they try to grow too fast and they put a bad operator into one of their territories and they don't perform like they know that market should be able to handle, they really lost revenue of that location because the local franchisee is not performing as well as they could be. Now, bad brands, on the other hand, they usually don't have a solid business model. So ultimately, they know that it's not going to work in every market, even if they have a really good operator who owns that location. So they're really playing the volume game. They want to sell as many franchise locations as possible because they know if they can sell out the entire country, they're going to have some franchisees that do well. They're going to have other franchisees that don't, but ultimately they're going to be okay because they're not looking to maximize the actual revenue per location. They're just trying to squeeze as much royalty as they can from a mediocre business model. Now, how we're able to navigate this red flag is to be really aware of how the brand is conversating with you during this process. Again, with a good brand, they're going to be evaluating you as much as you're evaluating them. So, be aware of what types of questions they're asking. Are they being critical about figuring out who you are or what your goals are with the business? Does it feel like it's an interview that you're undergoing with the brand? If so, it's a good sign that it's a good brand. Now, on the flip side of things, if the brand doesn't ask too many deep questions and they're really trying to rush the development process along to ultimately get you to say, I want to move forward, that's typically a sign that it's a bad brand. Moving on to red flag number two, the brand does not show average revenue and profit figures in their FDD for all their franchise locations. Now, what is the FDD? The FDD, or the franchise disclosure document, is a federally regulated document that essentially outlines the entirety of the business model. Now, it's broken down into specific sections or items, and each item pertains to a certain aspect of the business. Now, One of the items that I like to pay particular attention to is the item 19, or the earnings claim. In this item, a brand is able to give real financial metrics of units within their system. Now, there is no standardized form in terms of how they're able to display this information. It more so serves as a snapshot and not a full picture. Brands can choose to just do average revenue and no profit. They can do a full P&L of one specific location, or they can show no information in their item 19 at all. They're not required to do so. But ultimately, the gold standard in item 19 is a full average revenue and profit of all locations that they have in their system. And it makes sense. If you have a really good franchise brand, it should work in pretty much any market you go to. So why wouldn't you show an average of all your locations? But there are some legitimate reasons as to why a franchise brand that is good wouldn't show revenue or profitability figures. One example is if they're a newer brand that does have a really good business model, but a lot of the franchise locations are just not mature yet. They're still in their ramp up period. That brand might not want to artificially show low profitability metrics on units that are still working up to their max potential, because ultimately they know what the potential of their business model is, and they're waiting for their locations to reach maturity so they can advertise that. Another example is with business models that require a specific skill set from the owner. So if there is a model that really is predicated on the owner being highly versed in high pressure sales, how many people do you know that think they're really good at sales when they're really not? So, as a franchisor, if they explain that that's what ownership looks like, and the candidate says, yeah, I absolutely can do that, and here's my resume, and they wind up getting a location, but a few months in, they find out that they weren't as skilled as they thought they were, obviously they're going to be underperforming. And that's not a fair evaluation or representation of what the brand's business model can produce. So we're able to navigate this red flag in two ways. First is the unit economics call. Now, the unit economics call is a specific call you'll have during development where the brand is going to go over how the financials work within their model. Now, if they didn't show profitability in their item 19, this is a great time to bring up that point. Asking the brand, hey, you don't have profitability in your item 19, or you don't have an average of all your profitabilities. Can you explain that? This allows a good brand to explain why they don't, or could highlight a bad brand that is choosing not to. Regardless, something you really want to pay attention to is if the brand starts to make some promises towards financials that aren't represented in the item 19. Legally, they are not allowed to do that. So if a brand does say, hey, most of our locations are profiting 150,000 a year, that is a huge red flag if that's not being shown in their item 19. The second way we're able to navigate this is through current franchisee validation calls. Now, on validation calls, which is another portion of the development process, you're able to contact any franchisee in the system and pretty much ask them any question that you want the answers to. You can ask them things such as, what's your profitability look like? How fast did you get to cash flow positive? Or all the training and support the brand promised in development, was that true once you opened? No matter what the item 19 says, I always recommend for clients to really ask these deep financial questions on the validation calls, because ultimately that's going to be your best source of info gathering in the financial capacity. And lastly, this leads us to red flag number 3, which is bad current franchisee validation. Again, validation is a due diligence piece where you get to audit everything that the brand is promising you during development with real people who are actually doing what you're potentially looking to do. Now, it's not uncommon as you're doing these validation calls to hear one or two not ideal stories. I mean, ultimately, we're working with people, and people's expectations might not always be met 100% of the time. And this is true in all aspects of business and life in general. I mean, how many great products still get 1-star reviews? This red flag really shines through when the majority of validation calls are not positive and when the issues that franchisees are having are kind of all across the board. That can be really indicative of a bad business model. With that being said, we're able to navigate this red flag by really making a determination on if there's just a couple bad apples in the system or if holistically there's some major flaws that the majority of people you talk to are experiencing. Another way we're able to navigate this red flag is to really think if there's something specific that the majority of the franchisees have an issue with and comparing that to your skill set. And what I mean by that is if most of the franchisees you talk to mention that the brand promised that they were going to book all their jobs and they really weren't going to have to worry about marketing, but in reality, they only did about 50%, and there was still some work to be done on the marketing side of things. And you have a strong background and skill set in marketing, that might be an easy piece for you to fill. And if the rest of the system is pretty buttoned up and no one has any other complaints, that might not be a red flag at all. So these are my 3 red flags for you to watch out for to make sure that the franchise that you're looking at isn't a bad one. And just as a little PS, if you are evaluating a specific franchise option and you've gone through this checklist and determined that you are speaking with a good brand, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good fit for you. Like any major life decision, there's a number of factors that you have to weigh in. With franchising specifically, you have to think about things such as what's the owner's role in the business? How do I view this industry ongoing? Do I see this industry growing or is this just a fad? And also, will the model work in my local market specifically after factoring in demand and other competition from individuals in your area? But at the very least, I hope this serves as a good starting point for you to consider as you start to seriously evaluate franchise options.